Today we're talking about right triangle intersections, 45-degree intersections. And we're going to be working on a 45-degree grid. We're not going to be adding any new creases, and yet there's a huge variety of patterns that we can get from this foundational knowledge. So first, let's dive into what are the variety of ways we can use this idea, and then we'll go into specifically how do we fold this pattern from the right triangle intersections, these 45-degree intersections. And stick around till the end to see how we can apply that knowledge to reverse engineering a broad array of patterns. So diving into the specifics, I've got some crease patterns here to show you. And what we're going to do is see the crease pattern and then see how it plays out on the paper. And these are slightly different grids in the crease pattern versus the paper. I've got a 16-fold 45-degree grid here, single diagonal. Notice it's easier to see on the crease pattern that I have a single diagonal in this corner square. If I was to say a double diagonal grid, then I would have both diagonals in the corner square, and the diagonals would act as these skinnier pleat directions, and the horizontal and vertical would act as this thicker pleat direction. So I've got my single diagonal grid, and for demonstration purposes, you don't really need more than an 8-fold grid, but I've got 16 just in case we want to demonstrate something broader range. So I'm going to start by bringing up that horizontal and vertical mountain fold coming into the center, and the diagonal, you can see I didn't really encourage it to do this, but it's doing this mostly on its own, is coming down and to the left. Notice that if I was to fold this completely flat, if I wasn't doing tessellations, if I wasn't doing a pleat on each of these mountain folds, then this creates a flat foldable intersection. So that's what we're working with. And when we're talking about a 45-degree intersection, that the word intersection is distinguishing it from a twist. So in a twist, we would have all the pleats rotating around in the same direction, and that would prevent us from being able to lay this down flat without doing some extra work, adding new folds. So what can we do to make this lay flat? Well, I can take this horizontal pleat, and you can see in the crease pattern here, I've got a valley below. If I'm holding this like a twist, the valley is above the mountain. So if I put the valley below, all of a sudden it lays down flat. And if we take a look at the piece that we're going to fold later on, this is exactly so. Square corner on top of a 45-degree triangle, square corner on top of a 45-degree triangle. This is exactly the same thing going on here as here. Then moving on to a different way to lay these down flat. So we're going to pay attention to where the valleys are relative to the mountains. I'm going to keep this valley here. I'm going to keep this valley here. And I'm going to change the vertical pleat and just fold it over. So now I've got this corner. That's the 90 plus 45, 135 degrees, which might look familiar from this tessellation here. So this corner turns out to be the same as all of these corners. Okay, what's another option? I can have both of these horizontal and vertical folds coming up and in. And actually, that might be a more accurate match, but it's hard to tell. Let's see, this is on a double diagonal grid. So yeah, that is the more accurate match in here. I've got these two flaps that are 90 degrees apart from each other that are coming towards each other. That's what I've got in here as well. So an option for a variation with the previous one on this, or this one to get this exactly. That still doesn't address how we get these sunken squares, but we'll get there. Then what's another option? We can come across and say, well, what if instead of keeping the mountain in the same place, I switch the mountain and the valley? So this shares the diagonal pleat that we already have. It shares this vertical pleat, but the mountain and the valley for the horizontal pleat have been switched. So what I'm going to do is open it up just enough. We can see the mountain comes out from the three-way intersection one, well, kind of two grid spacings, but it's to the next intersection with diagonals. And I'm going to poke that down so I can then swap the mountain and valley of that horizontal fold. So this is starting to look familiar. It's starting to look like this tessellation, where if we zoom in on these corners, I've got, and don't let this fool you, I've got 90 degrees here, but we're looking at just one half of it. So I have this intersection over a little flap underneath. So coming back out to here, we can see this orientation, and then we can pop down in these crease patterns. And by the way, you can get a PDF of these crease patterns by signing up for Tessellation Foundations at training.gatheringfolds.com/start. And if we combine two of these, so notice I'm cutting along this diagonal and mirroring over to get two of them, then what I've got here is same thing on both sides, and I can collapse that down and get a new interaction, which is exactly the 4 interactions around the center here. So that's how to read this document. You've got the top ones, which are a single idea isolated, and then the next row is mirrored along the central diagonal. The next row is spaced out a little bit, so the same thing as the one before, but spaced out. So instead of this, I would have an extra space and get this instead. And then coming further down, you can see how to combine 4 of them together. And there's multiple ways to go about that. So coming back up to the top, there's still more options. So that one, coming back to the top in our paper, had the horizontal pleat with the mountain and valley reversed. Well, what if we reverse the diagonal pleat? So bringing the horizontal back, I'm going to take the diagonal and, paying attention, it goes one space as a mountain, pops down, and then we can have the mountain come up. So it's going one space down. We've got a valley running two spaces until the mountain hits. And we can carry that over. Now this looks really familiar from this tessellation. It looks like what's going on in here. So we had, and it also looks pretty similar to what's going on in here. We had the interaction that we saw earlier to get this 90-degree corner sticking out over bars that go away. And now we're seeing how we can get these interactions in here. Then coming over, once again, the square twist is an option in this arrangement of things. So we can bring in and notice each corner of the square twist is a 90-degree angle with a pleat coming straight out of it. This will work to create our square. And fun fact, if you want to rigidly fold your square, you can, so I'll bring that up again, you can fold the center in half and then open up the pleats. And you can change the parity, change the pleat of any edges that you want. 1, 2 on opposite sides. You can really do whatever you want. What I've restricted in this document is I'm making sure I'm not showing things that are already shown from the point of view of the opposite side of the paper. So you can take this further, but just know that it'll be the same on the back side as something you've already seen from the front. And then you can take that idea one step even further. It doesn't work with all mountains, but you can stretch out this central shape. And again, I said it doesn't work with all mountains. That's because it will self-intersect in the back. But what you can do is turn one of these longer edges into a valley, which changes the pleat that comes off of it, switches the mountain and the valley. And then you can get a cool effect in there. And one more, we can do an isoarea style thing where we also change one of the short edges as well. And now we have this funky intersection on both sides. So that's how to read this set of crease patterns. And there are quite a few of them. Some of them don't have the option to mirror along the central diagonal. So this one has a fold along the central diagonal, so it can't duplicate that fold on top of itself. So it just has a stretched out version. Then some of them, so these are mirrored and mirrored. I have the diagonals going out. Some of them are more amenable to that, some of them are not. But let's return to our target tessellation and start folding what we came to fold. So I'll start by showing that interaction again. So I've got my horizontal, my vertical, and my diagonal as mountains. And I'm going to make sure that my horizontal and my vertical are falling away from each other. And the diagonal really has two options of which way to fold down to get that little triangle that we wanted. So here we can see that repeated 8 times around the center. And I've got a 16-fold single diagonal triangle or 45-degree grid here. You can see the single diagonal in the corner box. There is no diagonal in the other direction. So what we need to do is decide, okay, what's going to be our center, what's going to be the outside. This is the same grid in the demonstration that I have for folding it. So I'll use the same center. Looking at it, I've got my center here, and then 2 spacings to a valley, 3 to a mountain, and I'll use that as my guide. So whenever I'm reverse engineering, I want to first understand what's going on. So seeing, okay, they're using this interaction, and we've got mirror symmetry lines in 4 directions. So we have a mirror across here and across here, but we also see mirror symmetry here and here and here and here. So we're taking this one intersection and then drawing mirror symmetry lines as close as possible around it and repeating that over the whole design. And we can have variations on this. We can have mirror symmetry lines stretched further out in various directions, but we'll go with the densest one so we can get the most repetitions for today. So coming in to folding, I'm going to use colors to tell me what to do. So I noticed that, and I can even do this without moving flaps on the paper. If I see that I have a center and then 1 spacing away there is a folded mountain, I know there needs to be a valley underneath that because we don't have any mountains on their own. They're always paired with a valley in a pleat. So I know that valley needs to be sitting up here, so it has to be 2 spaces away from the center. So then I can draw these valleys onto my copying paper. And then I'll go ahead and add the segments of mountain that I can see in this drawing. So from there, it might be a little bit hard to see, but we need to find out where our horizontal, vertical, and diagonal folds are. So what we see here is that we've got our horizontal and then our diagonal goes in and out. But is it actually going in and out? If we think about this unfolding in our brain, we can see the diagonal actually goes straight across the corner of the valleys. So how do I know that? Well, I can visualize and see, oh, my valleys cover this entire square. So if the diagonal is going straight from one of these horizontals to one mountain to the mountain over here, and it crosses that point, it needs to cross that point in my copying piece as well. So then I can go ahead and say, okay, here's my intersections. I can also say that by looking and saying, hey, these make little squares. If one edge is here, I know it's not going to be a square this way, so it has to be a square this way, and therefore my diagonal goes out, flowing from the intersection of the horizontal and vertical. So either way is a great way to visualize what's going on. Now that we have an idea of what we're going to fold, I'm going to start by bringing up the mountains of one of these intersections. Notice I'm ignoring this intersection down below. I'm ignoring this intersection above. I'm just going to work with one of them. And I can tell which way my folds need to go by saying, hey, I have this valley and it goes all the way up into the corner. I need to fold over that. So my diagonal isn't coming in this way, it's going out that way. Likewise, for my horizontal, I need to keep these spread away from each other, so the valley needs to be on top. And then I can work my way around the tessellation using this idea. So coming down to the next intersection, bringing up all of the mountains and letting them lay down in the orientation that keeps my box and keeps my central square of valleys. I'll rotate and do exactly the same thing. First with the top of my little box, and then with the bottom. One of the things I'm doing here is making sure that everything I've folded previously is staying put while I put in the new stuff. Then rotating, I'm going to hold on to this while I open up that diagonal pleat to set up my next intersection. And notice I got a little bit of crumpling there on the inside. I'll reach in with my bone folder and poke at that until all of my folds are on grid lines. Then coming around, I'll do it again. And here I have my pleat intersection. I actually had a pleat intersection for the last one as well, but I glossed over that. Here it's going to be easiest to do both of these at the same time, to open it up, get this box tube, however you want to think of it, and making sure that the valleys are in the right place. I then can push that in towards the center. So I've used the same intersection 8 times around the center. Next up, I'm going to repeat that further out. I'm going to do another ring around the center, working my way through, trying to avoid pleat overlaps and resolving them when they do come up. So I know that this little box is 2 by 2 grid spacings. So I'm going to need to open up the pleat above, define the corner, and it's actually going to be easier here to do both of them. So I end up with a diagonal pleat out instead of a pleat overlap. And then I know that all the pointy ends come together because we saw that all the pointy ends come together in this tessellation that I'm copying. And so we end up with a completed little box. You can also see this general shape in, for example, a squashed open water bomb base. There's a lot of ways to get this general shape. And you can see the shape not folded flat in another tessellation. Ilan Garibi's red flower is exactly the same geometry. It just doesn't have as many grid lines, and so you need to puff the central square. Coming on around, I'm going to choose to resolve this next tube and come back for the corners. I'm emphasizing that this is a choice because you could do it the other way and you would end up getting all of these little bits in each corner right away. But I want to practice and add on a little bit at a time and repeat the same steps over and over so we can be confident that you have mastered them. So I'm going to open up, so we had that tube, I'm going to open it up, create that square box with the diagonals running out from it. And once more, the pointy bits go near the other pointy bits. That's really as much thinking as I'm doing with how these are oriented. And rotate around. Open up the tube so it's a square with diagonals going out. Pointy bits go to the other pointy bits. And rotate around. Open up the tube so it's a square with diagonals. Pointy bits go to the other pointy bits. Okay, so now we're ready for the next step. We've got these tubes going out and they're diagonal pleats. So they're going to be pointy bits for one grid spacing. And I'll zoom in a little more. There we go. So they're going to be pointy bits for one grid spacing, and then they're going to have the square on top. So notice I'm kind of pivoting on this point. I've got my valley fold in here, and I'm opening that up and letting it come together. Now I have one flap laying on top of another flap. It would be a pretty harsh pleat overlap if I had any more grid. What I'm going to do is grab that second diagonal pleat, bring it in, and do the same thing. So I'm, again, pivoting one spacing from the pointy tip. And what I'm going to do here is, instead of letting these pleats overlap, I'm going to pop up so I have two grid spacings of diagonal between these two 45-degree intersections. And I'm going to bring the center of those two diagonals in so I can fold my flaps on top. Now I'm going to do this 3 more times, so don't worry if you didn't catch it on the first iteration. Rotating around, same thing again. I'm going to have the valley coming to the corner. That is exactly the same corner as we had in the center. I'm going to open up my pleats so I can get a horizontal and a vertical out of it. Then for the other diagonal, I'm also pivoting. I've got that valley coming straight to the pointy end. My mountains are coming off one spacing away from the valley. And I have a bit of a dilemma with this section above, which I will resolve by forming what I can of those little squares. I'm going to have 2 spacings of diagonal in between, and I'm going to bring the center of those 2 spacings of diagonals in to the middle of my loop of 8 of these 45-degree intersections. Okay, continuing around, we're going to do the same exact thing, starting with setting up the top square, then setting up the bottom square, and then we will run the diagonals between the squares, which helps to finish the squares, at least what we can of them. If we had more grid, we would have those same tubes running out that we did after the first round around the center. And then coming around to our fourth and final corner, we're going to do exactly the same thing, getting first one little square set up, then another, running the diagonal between the corners, which will get everything nice and in position. So there we have our exact duplicate of what we had before. Now this one's looking more puffy than this one because this one sat under something heavy for a while. So we've got these intersections and we can use them to create whatever we want. Now there are a few intersections that I did not cover today, and they look something like this. So let's take one of these points. So this is getting into the things that are not in the crease patterns that I showed you. Let's see if we can figure out how they work. So I'm going to start by saying this is a point that has mountain and valley spread apart from each other. I've got 45 degrees between them. So I need to figure out how the heck am I going to get that to lay flat? Well, what I'm going to do is, and you may not have exactly the piece in front of you. This might be a bit of a bigger challenge. But what I can see just from looking from above is it's sticking out over some hole. And I don't have any broader thing sitting under it. Another clue is looking at the back. So thank you, Chris, for your question. We can see there's a bunch of layers here in the back. That is also going to be a clue. So flipping over, if I have an intersection, so one good idea when trying to reverse engineer this is to mark the things that you know to be true. So I know that at least in the far field, my valleys are here and my mountains are here. Then closer in, we have questions about that. And I can, for example, and I'm experimenting with this in real time. Like, I know I was able to reverse engineer it to get this thing done, but that was several years ago. So we're seeing real-time exploration here. And one of the things that I notice is that I need valleys in these locations to get everything tucked and under. And then I'm going to end up with this tuck in here. And Also going to get a tuck in here. So that's looking pretty good, but not quite there yet. So I've got this much, and I need to figure out exactly how this fluffy bit, well, if I hold it in front of the camera, that would help. Figure out how the fluffy bit interacts with everything else. I have a suspicion that it goes like this. Okay. So that's looking pretty good. It might not be the whole story though. So bringing this up, I see there's more that's being dealt with in there, and I can also get hints from the symmetry of the pattern. So this pattern has mirror symmetry lines in 4 directions, and it's repeating this center out here in these corners as well. It has a different interaction in here. This one is actually one that is familiar to us from these guys in here, and this one sticking out. I would say most familiar from these, because that's exactly the interaction going on in here. And so if I'm going to have a mirror symmetry line here, I cannot have a diagonal pleat. It must be horizontal. So I need to figure out how can I get this pleat to go horizontal. And so I'm stacking on another intersection down below to get all of my pleats in the proper orientation, so I can then mirror along these lines. And checking my prototype here, it seems I have even more layers, but this is looking pretty good, and I would be happy to go ahead and mirror and copy this intersection. So that's what we're looking at when we're trying to figure out, okay, how do I copy from something else, even something that has some complication to it. So if we open this up, I'm going to sketch on the crease pattern here. I'm going to do it quickly before I lose all of my folds. So that one went one more spacing. So another thing to keep in mind here, especially if you're trying to draw a crease pattern for these things, is some rules about the numbers of mountains and valleys that must come together in order to create a flat intersection. The rule is that the number of mountains and the number of valleys that come together have to be different by 2. And this is a mathematical rule. And so anytime we have our mountains and valleys coming together, we want to double check that we're following these rules. And in this case, we're mostly going to have 3 of one kind and 1 of the other. But we do have one intersection here that has 5 mountains and 3 valleys. There's additional rules with like alternating angles have to add up to each other. So with every intersection, we're going to have an even number of angles. And so angles 1 and 3 going around need to add up to 180, and angles 2 and 4 going around the intersection also need to add up to 180 degrees. So this is a lot more complicated than the intersections that I showed you before, but that's mostly because it's taking basically multiple of these intersections. So we've got this is the first flat state, and then we want to get rid of this diagonal pleat. So we put in another of our standard intersections that converts the single diagonal pleat into a horizontal and a diagonal in the appropriate direction. And so with that, we're able to create our next addition. So one of the things, one of the differences here, so I've got additional crunching of layers to get a square corner on here. If I was to exactly mirror this right now, I would end up with an octagon on the back. So this isn't quite exactly a duplicate of this piece, but it will still work. And that's one of the interesting things about origami. When we're seeing other people's patterns and we try and reverse engineer it, we might successfully reverse engineer exactly what they did, or we might come up with something new. So it's always fun to go explore and get inspiration from other people's patterns and see what we can figure out on our own. So in addition to these, I sent out a link in my my weekly email this morning to a clover variation that you might be able to figure out based on getting this and the standard clover. So I invite you to go explore, reverse engineer what you can, and see if you can come up with another combination that you haven't seen before to fold something new. Happy folding, y'all, and see you next week.